Okay, I think we'll get it going, and inshallah, the others can join in as we go. And I think we are now live streaming as well. So, salam alaikum to all of you, and I welcome our speakers and also our attendees. And I would like to thank our speakers for our panelists for giving us their time and their perspectives. Today, the subject, of course, is community mental resilience, the bounce back. And this is a sequel to the last web panel that we conducted, which was called Building a Stronger and Mentally Resilient Community. We had, again, three wonderful panelists at that talk, and we covered a vast range of subjects from epidemiology of COVID-19 to the mental stigma, rather the stigma around mental illness. We spoke about social isolation of youth and the challenges arising from that. We spoke about the family environment, especially parent and child relationships in all of these situations when faced with difficulty and stress. So we also received a number of very appreciative emails saying that it was a wonderful session and that we should do a sequel to it. And therefore, today we are presenting that sequel, and we've called it quite aptly Bounce Back. Because from a Melbourne perspective, as we all know, we are now 23 days without a new case of COVID of COVID-19. So yes, much reason to be jubilant, much reason to celebrate, much reason to be joyous, but at the same time, not forgetting what a lot of us have been through, the difficulties that we've had, the night curfews, the 5 kilometer limit, then the 25 kilometer limit, not being able to meet with friends, not being able to meet with family, grandchildren. It's still quite fresh in our minds. So I think the objective is for today is basically two. One is what can we learn from the challenges that we have been through, and how can we apply these not just through what we have been, but in terms of facing future such difficulties, not in terms of a pandemic like this, but in other perhaps personal challenges. And while we talk about resilience and bounce back, some of us fortunately are able to be more resilient and bounce back, but there are perhaps others that are not able to do so. So the second point is reaching out to them, because this is still a time of stress, a time of economic and social suffering, with people needing help. So, not forgetting that perspective while everything looks good, but at the same time, we need to be able to reach out and help people who are not able to access what they need. So, so just going back to the subject about resilience, resilience is not just about going through life on a breeze or just by skating by all of the challenges, but rather it is about experiencing the negative, difficult, and distressing events that life throws at you, and yet staying on task, staying optimistic, and staying high functioning. In fact, developing resilience basically requires a level of emotional distress, because if we never run into disappointment in the first place, then we will never learn how to deal with it. Some of us are more resilient than others, but we have all been knocked down, defeated, and despondent at some time in our lives. However, we kept on going, and here we are today, stronger and more experienced. So, how did we cope? What lessons are there to be learned? How did we apply these? How do we apply these to future such experiences and yet emerge stronger, more experienced, and more supportive of each other? And how do we still maintain that empathy of understanding other people's difficulty and stress and reach out to them as well? So, to help us understand and hear their own perspective based on their knowledge and their wide experience, I will now um, I now have the pleasure of introducing our expert panel for today. Dr. Usman Mansoor is a consultant psychiatrist. He holds a master's degree in psychiatry from the University of Melbourne and a master's of public health from the University of Sydney. Dr. Mansoor works with adolescents and adults who are experiencing mood disorders and other mental health conditions and are seeking help to improve their quality of life, which is very, very important. His main areas of expertise are around treating bipolar disorder, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, adult ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and psychosis. And he has experience working with both the rural as well as the metropolitan communities. Dr. Mansoor's therapeutic style is to provide a holistic approach and work with his clients to combine biological, psychological, and social intervention. He uses a range of counseling techniques and pharmacotherapy wherever appropriate. So, welcome and thank you, Dr. Mansoor. Sister Razia Fanam. Razia is entering her final year of a Bachelor of Media and Communication at Swinburne University. She is currently working as a communications officer at the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Center. Razia chairs the Youth Dawa subcommittee at the Board of Imams and has been involved in the Swinburne Islamic Society. She is passionate about increasing and emphasizing Muslim representation in Western media and aspires to be a digital journalist for the ABC. Thank you once again, Razia, and we are really pleased that you have been able to join us and give us a more youthful perspective to us, uncle and aunties, if I can use that term. Dr. Mariam Hussain is a graduate from Osmania University in Hyderabad. Dr. Hussain has been working in Australia since her arrival here in 1973, and Dr. Mariam has worked in mental health psychiatric hospitals as well as in community mental health from 1975 to 2003. Since 2003, Dr. Hussain is practicing as a GP specialist in mental health. So a very experienced, very specialized panel indeed. And I again thank you all for agreeing to be with us today. My first question is to Dr. Hussain. The Australian Institute of Family Studies put out a paper in 2016, which amongst other things encourages practitioners to understand recovery in a family context, particularly with a focus on strengthening parent-child relationships and supporting families to identify what recovery means to them. With your tremendous experience, Dr. Hussain, what would you say about recovery that occurs in a family context, please?
Thanks for having me. And shall I start with praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and salatu salam at Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi. Yes, the bouncing back phenomenon or the resilience is very much depends upon the person's ability. There is resilience, which is defined as one's ability to recover and adapt to the life's challenging situations. Some people seem to quickly bounce back from personal failure and setbacks, while others find it very difficult. People who lack this ability feel the emotional pain, feel helpless, turn to maladaptive methods of self-medication and substance abuse. I think it's a dilemma, I'm not sure, but very often it is discussed as whether it is a learned phenomenon or it need to be learned. In my opinion, I think it is both. an individual's previous experiences and how the person have dealt with it has very much to do with the next course of their life and the development of the personality. This is the reason that we need to be more thoughtful of children and young adults who don't have much life experiences. It is a quality that can be learned through practices, discipline, and hard work. It needs flexibility and strength. It is the ability to stay strong in the face of adversity, to keep your focus and determination. It needs positive approach to take what comes as a challenge and an opportunity rather than as a threat and make negative conclusions. Optimistic approach is better than pessimistic approach. In situation with the family, I think this COVID situation had given various examples of how the parents dealt with their children, what sort of explanations they have given to their children. And especially with the homeschooling at those times, there were various challenges to various parents. A mother of a 5-year-old who just started prep told me when she was in kinder, she loved going to kinder. She was looking forward to go to school. But since the school started, it was only for a very short while. And then there was Zoom. And she hated that. She hated that. And this is a child that's very outgoing, very, her vocabulary is very good. And she's a sort of social person who likes playing with other kids and all that. And once the Zoom schooling started, she hated it. And she said to her mother that she hates school. And every time it was a struggle for the mother to sit with her for the schooling. And the mother was getting more anxious than her, I think. And finally, when the restrictions lifted, she bounced back. She bounced back and she was the same child as she was before. So this is an example of a primary school girl who, with no problem at all, bounced back to going school. So far, I have not heard of anybody, although this particular girl's mother was a bit scared or fearful of she hating school, whether she will go back to school or not. But so far I haven't heard of any parent or child who has had difficulty returning back to school. I will give another example from one of my patients. I call her patient A. She has been known to me for a long while. An only child to her parents, and she's now 73 years old, lives with her husband, came to Australia at the age of 4 and in 1956 on a ship. And, the early days in those times, 56 was quite far away. And European children's, although there was a white Australia policy at that time, only migrants from Europe were allowed. Even then, they were not welcome. So this girl had a lot of difficulty at school and she struggled. And then at home, both parents had to work and mother gave her chores to do at home when she's at work. And not just the chores at home, but she had a cousin to look after as well. And various other difficulties as well. And at this time, to cut the story short, she is coping with 6 to 7 different crippling diagnoses, 11 different medication, and she recently had a loss of vision of one of her eye, and she has problem with mobility. She's still adjusting to the loss of the vision of her eye, and then have to use the mask when she goes out shopping. But this woman struggles. She does not want to stay home or does not want to be called as disabled. She does what we all do, and she keeps going. And she lost her mother about a couple of months ago, and she told me at her funeral, at the end of the eulogy, she said to her mother, "Thanks, Mom, for making the woman that I am." So all the struggle that she went through, and the mother who made her work right from the beginning as a primary school girl, she learned a lot about life. And the cousin she looked after, she also described that cousin who is not capable of doing much. So I guess it's in the family, it does depend upon how the children are brought up, and how the children, what sort of information is given, how the children are dealt with. Too much of love can also spoil that ability of resilience. If I can give the example of the Prophet ﷺ, his whole life was example of resilience. Losing his father before he was born, then losing his mother while he was still a child, and then grandfather, and so many difficulties that he went through. When I read about his life, I was amazed how he could cope with so many deaths of his own children, the boys as children, and then the girls, who was Ruqayya Raziyallah Anha died when Rasulullah Sallallahu returned from the Battle of Badr. There was happiness of Battle of Badr, winning the Battle of Badr, then the unhappiness of he losing the child. But he never stopped. He never stopped. He went on and on. This is something we need to learn. I'll stop here.
Okay, Jazakallah. And yes, we'll come back to you a bit later on, Dr. Hussain. My next question is to Razia. I think I have mentioned to you that I was quite impressed by the opening speech that Dennis Noah gave to the Global Solutions Summit. Not sure if you've had a chance to go through it, but he made a pretty good analysis of some of the soul searching or consideration that we as humans could perhaps take from the pandemic, where he talks about serving human needs and human purposes, where he talks about pursuing our overarching communitarian goals articulated in both our religious and our cultural aspirations, and says that what we have been through highlights the uncertainty of human life, of human existence, and the vulnerability of human life. Now, in light of all of these things, particularly looking broadly at the environment, at everything else that's happening around us, and given your own work with the bushfire and natural hazards, I'm wondering if you could give us some perspectives from your point of view on some of the things that he has been talking about.
Jazakallah khair. That's a very interesting question. And I think, firstly, there's one main question that arises from all of this, and that is the question of whether individual struggles are more or less important than the problems we face as a collective community. And in my opinion, I don't think that one is more important than the other. I think they both work in tandem alongside each other. You know, it's the age-old concept of the individual versus society, which is a complex concept. On one hand, you could argue that worrying about a single person is selfish when there are wider community problems that affect us all. But on the other hand, one could argue that the issues faced by youth make up a huge portion of society and therefore of societal struggles, and so should be addressed. And ultimately, I think it comes down to, in order for society to function and thrive and achieve all those communitarian goals, every member of society, every demographic, regardless of age or culture or religion, needs to be heard and supported and acknowledged in their individual struggles. Because I think by focusing on individuals, we can fulfill the needs and purposes of society as a whole. And particularly in the COVID era, where families are being kept apart and schools and unis closed, work moved online to working from home. And in stage 4 lockdown, there was no sense of community or belonging like there usually is. And I think in those kind of circumstances, it's very easy for youth not to feel supported. And it's really easy for them to keep those struggles hidden and to yourself, especially when those struggles have to do with feeling isolated. And then when we're told that our problems are not important, it just makes you want to hide them all the more, which can have extremely negative psychological impacts, as Dr. Mariam was saying. And so it's extremely important, I think, to normalize talking about issues at an individual level so that we can come together collectively to figure out how we can help. And I think in the context of wider societal struggles, youth issues make up a huge proportion of that. And at the end of the day, the future of society is the youth. So if we are not supported and encouraged and heard now, then what will become of the leaders of tomorrow? Brushing individual needs under the metaphorical rug of community spirit is quite honestly hypocritical and counterintuitive. The 2020 Global Solutions Summit that you mentioned was for exactly that. It was for global solutions. So for those who aren't familiar, in his closing address, Dennis Snower emphasized the global challenge of COVID-19. He spoke of global problems and setting global goals to guide our global learning processes to create resilience in these rapidly changing times. And all of that is completely valid. As a global challenge, COVID-19 requires global collaborations. And as Snower said, self-interest and autonomy alone cannot solve the growing international problems of inequality, resource depletion, biodiversity loss, climate change, and financial instability. But what then about the 2020 high school graduates who haven't been able to enjoy their final year of school, or the numerous university graduates who haven't been able to secure a job because of all the job cuts, or the young people in the workforce who were cut from their jobs because their companies could only afford to keep the older, more experienced employees? What about the international students stuck in a foreign country, with no outlook on when they can return home? And the young people living on their own for the first time, completely cut off from everyone they know and love. Are their problems suddenly minimized and pushed aside just because there are bigger global challenges we need to face? Of course not. Our struggles are still real and valid and should be recognized. And if we're talking about serving human needs and purposes, as Dennis Snower mentioned, does that suddenly not include the actual humans who make up larger societies and communities and countries? That's like saying if I have a twisted ankle, my pain isn't valid because my bigger, stronger, more important neighbor has a broken arm. That fact doesn't decrease my pain. It's still there and it's still valid, even if it's seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that the believers are like one body. When one limb suffers, the whole body responds to it with fever. And this shows us that community spirit is affected by individual struggle. Everyone's issues are valid and should be acknowledged, even if in comparison to the world's struggles, it seems unimportant. The international community and the natural world have been greatly impacted by the COVID-19 storm that has hit us all. There are massive global problems that need addressing and that need solutions. But at the end of the day, how can we expect to find solutions for the rest of the world if we can't even fix the problems in our own neighborhoods? Change begins and ends with individual people. If one person misses a step, then the whole marching band halts. If we can't keep our own homes together, how are we to go and build and maintain new ones? And if one small group of people is left unheard and unattended, then what hope is there for the rest of the world? That's it for me.
Mashallah. I cannot disagree with anything that you have said. And I think that's part of the ongoing process, that we really need to fix our own backyard before we start going around trying to tell other people what to do. And inshallah, I hope that as a community, we will be able to come together stronger and better because of this, and work with each other in delivering some of the things that you have just spoken about, Razia. So thank you very much for that. And of course, I will come back to you with a supplementary question. Dr. Usman, coming to you now. Timothy Vaughan from the University of Sydney, writing in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry, says that recovery is about a focus on resilience and wellness, not a fixation with risk and illness. And he also talks about shifting away from pathology and dysfunction into skills, attributes, and optimal functioning. What would you have to say about that, Doctor?
Thank you, Mr. Shabir. Timothy talks about the recovery model in this article, which is a shift away from our traditional biological model or biomedical model. And I'll just talk a little bit give a brief overview about the recovery in the mental health context, because most of the mental illnesses are long-standing, chronic, and disabling. So we talk about functional recovery instead of clinical recovery. People will continue to have some limitations because of the mental illness, but they can recover and lead a meaningful life full of hope and as normal life as they can. And the recovery model treats illness of a person rather than focusing on the disease of the organ, in which the traditional medical model is. It's a more holistic approach, taking into account the not only the biological side of things, but also the psychological, social, cultural, religious, and all those factors. And it means that we need to involve the patient in their care, so that they can make an informed decision rather than keeping a paternalistic attitude and making decisions on their behalf. It also means that every individual is different and they need a different treatment, not one size fits all approach for the patients. No two people with depression will be the same. And it depends on the resilience and multiple other factors as well. Not everyone will need medication. Some will just need psychological therapy or just to learn new coping skills and strategies to help deal with the trauma they're going through or whatever illness they're going through. Even if we look at the WHO definition of health, it is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just merely an absence of the disease. So it also talks about all the different aspects in the health, but generally when we talk about health, most people think of the physical health and physical side of things, but it's much more than that. So the recovery-oriented practice started back in late 1980s and early 1990s, and was first published in 1993 in an American journal. And now these recovery-oriented practices have been incorporated in the National Mental Health Plan in Australia as well. And it focuses on increasing the independence of the individuals and even with the limitation of mental illness and keeping them connected to the community. And this is one of the starting moves that started the process of deinstitutionalization and keeping a shift from mental asylum to making them part of the community as well. My experience is that when we talk about the coping strategies and learning new skills and all, and even just giving education to the person so that they can know their illness and know the prognosis of the illness and what the medications can do to you. So that alone relieves a lot of anxiety regarding their illness. And medication is not 100% effective. It's most of the antidepressants have a response rate of 65%. So 65 out of 100 people will benefit from the medications, other won't. So we need to add in other strategies. And from my experience, when we've combined the medications with the psychotherapy and other form of therapies, and there's always a better outcome as compared to just the medication alone or just the psychotherapy. So it needs to be a holistic treatment approach and tailor-made for the particular individual. And that's the most effective strategy in my opinion. And also in terms of building resilience, like every person, like other my colleagues talked about, is different, and some people are more resilient than the others. But there's ways to build on that resilience, and there's different techniques. One such technique I'll talk about is the cognitive restructuring. Oftentimes, and that's part of the CBT therapy, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy. So we all, based on our own experiences, we have certain automatic thoughts. For some people, that can be negative if they've had negative or traumatic experiences in the past. And oftentimes, whatever our thoughts are telling us, we believe it's true, and we just act on those thoughts without actually trying to evaluate those thoughts. So I advise my patients to, even though they are your own thoughts, but try to look at it as some other person giving you advice. And when someone gives you advice, you don't necessarily take advice without even thinking whether it's good for you or not. So just try to practice and see whether you need to act on those thoughts or there could be some other explanation. Whenever you get a thought, try to evaluate and see what's the evidence that this is, like, for example, if there's an automatic thought that I'm not a good person and I'm useless or something like that, which is common in depression, and just ask yourself, what is the evidence? And is there any other explanation for it? And try to have a more positive approach towards life. Obviously in the pandemic, there was a loss of social connections, which there was a lot of disruption and people were not able to meet their loved ones and caused a lot of increase in the number of anxiety and depression across Australia and I'm sure in other parts of the world as well. So in times like this, a lot of people made use of whatever was available, like the technology, to connect with their loved ones, even though it's not the same, but it's still they were able to take a positive approach and make use of whatever was available, rather than just sitting by themselves and not doing anything. So again, that's the positive thinking and the positive approach, and that helps. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. I'm going to go off script here, Doctor. And I am going to ask you about your perspective on a concept called neuro-linguistic programming. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it is a methodology that a lot of coaches, human coaches, mental coaches, professional coaches use. It's more like a suggestive conversation where you are putting words into the heads of the people. And that's why it is called neuro-linguistic programming, because the words tend to act on the nerves. So I just want to ask you if you're aware of this and what are your thoughts about?
Well, I'm not an expert on this. I've just got a limited information on this, so I'm not too sure. But I know that psychologists and motivational speakers and people like that, they use this sort of technique to influence people into a more positive approach.
Okay, but whether it works or not is to be seen, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. No, thank you. Thank you for that, Doctor. Okay, I'm going to go back to Sister Razia now. Now, obviously, the government's response in a way highlights the kind of problems that they see happening with, okay, I will use COVID-19 as an example, but it goes around any other natural disaster as well. So the Australian government has put in about $48 million as a support of the mental health and well-being pandemic response, which is basically highlighting the ways to help Australians cope with staying connected, building a daily routine, maintaining a healthy lifestyle. Now, I know that we all had challenges. I have had challenges as well. And, Alhamdulillah, I think my wife and children tell me my cooking is pretty good these days. So I think that was my way of coping. But from your experience, how did people cope during this isolation, the staying away, being unsocial, not being connected?
Jazakallah khair. Honestly, this isn't an easy question to answer because, as Dr. Mansoor said, everyone's situation is so unique and individual. And we can also look at, the concept of coping from so many different angles. Alhamdulillah, for me personally, I had it relatively easy. I got to keep my job and just moved to working from home. But I know a lot of first-time job holders like myself weren't so lucky. And I also have a big and close family, which is both a blessing and a curse when you're stuck with them 24/7. But I know that it's still been a really stressful period. And I know a lot of young people have been in a very similar boat. And so there are a few things that I found helped me cope during the sudden, impositions on the normal everyday lives that we had led until this year particularly. And the first and most beneficial thing for me came purely from an Islamic perspective. I think having tawakkul in Allah and truly relying on Him and trusting in Allah's plan as the best of planners it's honestly such a blessing that we have as Muslims. Even beyond just the hardships brought by COVID, anything that we face that tests our patience, that brings grief and sorrow or stress, we always have Allah to turn to trust in. And we know that whatever He subhanahu wa ta'ala has planned is best for us. And we have that reassurance that with every hardship inflicted on us comes ease, that Allah would never put us through something we can't handle, that the harder that we are tested, the more we are loved by Allah. And I think we see people of other faiths or people of no faith, completely derail when they have to deal with something difficult. And the easiest example I can give is the death of a family member. You see people yell and curse and question, why did you take them? But for us as Muslims, we believe that it was their destined time to return to Allah and that, inshallah, we will reunite with them in a better place in the hereafter. And I think, in this context, with the constant increasing restrictions, the ever-lying disappointment and fear that came with the rising case and death numbers, there really was only one way we could turn. And, in Surah Baqarah, Allah tells us, seek help with perseverance and prayer, for Allah is with those who patiently persevere. We've been given the answer to dealing and coping with hardships, and that is turn to Allah because He has all the answers. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, also said, no fatigue, disease, sorrow, sadness, hurt, or distress befalls a Muslim, even if it were a prick from a thorn, but that Allah expiates his sins. And, it has been a hard and scary year, but I think it's a constant reassurance that if we remain patient in the face of adversity, Allah will not only bring the cure, but will also reward us and forgive us for persevering. And I don't know about anybody else, but I found lockdown amazing. With the lack of distractions and the sudden abundance of time that I was given, I found myself focusing on my Iman, educating myself, watching those lectures that I had saved to watch later, but never found the time to actually go back to. I spent more time on my prayers, and during Ramadan, I could stay up late in worship. And I think my Iman has never felt so rejuvenated and strong, alhamdulillah. And I think lockdown and the difficulty of this year has truly played a hand in that. So yes, it's been a hard and frustrating year, but we should also try and see the benefits that came out of it. But in saying that, of course, we do have to recognize that an increase in spiritual awareness is not a cure as such for mental illnesses. It's become increasingly common for young Muslims to be told that the reason that they're anxious or depressed is because their Iman is not strong enough, that they're not praying properly, or they're not being grateful for the blessings that Allah has given them. And this really isn't the right way to tackle psychological illnesses. When you're struggling with something internally and you gather up the courage to talk to someone about it, but then you're just told that you're not being grateful or that you just need to pray more, it's completely disheartening, and it's not the right tactic at all. And I think it's important for young people to know that their problems are valid and heard. And we need to find ways to cope and deal with our challenges by finding professionals who are also strong in their deen to talk to, who can guide us the right way. I think another thing is having a really good circle of friends that you can talk to, and keeping up strong family relations so that you always have a good support system. I think it's super important to feel connected and supported that way. I know this year has been exceptionally difficult for some people while in lockdown, but alhamdulillah, with the tech age, it's far easier to get in touch with people virtually when you can't physically meet anyone anymore. And I think knowing that others are experiencing similar emotions and worries to you can also make you feel less isolated in your struggle. And honestly, this is my last point, but putting yourself out there as best as you can, given the circumstances, is really helpful. If it's joining online halakas or your university's online clubs, and staying connected as best as you can, even when you think it's impossible. We're all on our individual journeys to find ourselves as Australian Muslims, to find our place in society, especially when that community feel has been so separate and scattered. But the beautiful thing is we're all in the same boat. So if we took the initiative to gather together in the ways that we can and build our own support groups and networks and fill in the gaps that we don't have, we can create amazing outcomes. And as I said earlier, the youth is the future. We don't need adults to prompt us into action. And I think if there's one thing we can learn from lockdown, it's that if we don't have the solutions right now, if we think that there is something wrong with our community, let's stop waiting around for solution and let's be the solution.
100%. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Yes, and I'm glad that most of us have been fortunate in having our communities, our families, and our circle of friends. So I hope that everybody else also has access to that, inshallah. Which leads me directly into my next question to Dr. Mariam Hussain. Again, usually they say that resilient people spend their time and energy focusing on situations and events that they have control over, because they put their efforts where they can have the most impact and they can feel empowered and confident. Now, part of this building of the resilience is like what Razia has just mentioned, faith and hope, Dr. Mariam. So what role would you say the spiritual quotient as opposed to EQ or IQ? What does the SQ have to play in the bounce back process? I think you need to unmute yourself, Dr. Hussain. Thank you.
Sorry. In America, Muslim scientists tested about 1,200 practicing Muslims during the COVID by asking questions about their view regarding the COVID situation. And quarter of the sample had no idea. 3% had no worries about what was going on. And 49% of were optimistic, whereas 20% were pessimistic. And 5% felt terrible. And they concluded with the saying that optimistic saw positive changes in the environment and in themselves. They engaged themselves in positive things. Pessimists were distressed. They could not see anything useful or positive. These reactions depends from before, what happens in life. Like I gave the example of my 73-year-old patient who went through her life with coping with lots of adversities in her life and kept coping. And that's how she saw her life as she always have to cope, and she continues to cope. So these reactions depends upon the life before, how their personalities have developed, what forces have played part in their lives. This again amazes me. It is very hard to fathom how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala influences each of us and how he makes the personality that we are from the forces that we go through. And some say that the influence of all this influences on us right from the time when we are in the wombs of our mother. Who controls all this? You know, if we don't believe in the super being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what will we say about these things? We can only conclude we are malleable when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directs us to do certain things and keep away from other things. We want to mold us, he wants to mold us in a better way, which we are capable of. It is not impossible. You know, when we have to obey certain laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for instance, if I can use the example of anger, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to control anger. And it is again a psychological thing, it's an emotional thing. And lots of people say that I can't control my anger. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't ask us to do anything that we can't do it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us, and He knows our psychology, what can be controlled and what can't be controlled. Yes, anger can be controlled, and that's why He has asked us to control it. And He knows that if people don't control the anger, you get into more problems. So what does not kill us makes us stronger. A Melbourne University professor, Lisa Gibbs, she's the leader of community resilience at the Center of Disaster Management. She claimed that the crisis, natural disasters and emergency events are also opportunities to better ourselves, to understand us as individuals and communities. And communities can grow in even the harshest conditions and appreciate the things in life that matter most. Most of the people get back on track. A significant minority will not and develop PTSD or phobic anxieties. To tell you the truth, when the COVID started, how I coped with it was my coping mechanism was to dig into the history. Has anything like this happened? And what I discovered was this sort of things have been happening since 1300 BC. And more recently, after the 6th century, it has been happening every century. And what interested me most was the famous plague of Amwas. In the Islam, this is in his Islamic history at the time of the Khalifa Amirul Mu'minin Umar Raziallahu anhu. And there was, it started in 600 something, but it went on till 688 to 689, and then 744 to 745. It kept coming back, like we are calling second wave, third wave, and the similar thing happened. And so many of the Sahaba died at that time. So many of the Sahaba died, and particularly Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah. He was 58 years old, and Muad ibn Jabal was 33 years old, and his entire family died before him. And Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan, Suhail ibn Amr, and his son Abu Jandal. Finally what happened was Amr ibn As was made the governor of the army, made the leader of the army. And what he did, so many people died, 20 to 25,000 Muslim soldiers died, and there were not much soldiers left. And Amr ibn As's concern was to save those soldiers. And he started putting the soldiers on the mountains, and he isolated them into groups. And this was the beginning of the theory of isolation. Method of isolation has been going on since then. And he isolated them for 40 days. And when they came clear of that plague, he moved forward to Egypt to conquer Egypt. And after all this, he went ahead to conquer Egypt. And there are lots of things to learn from this plague of Amwas. I don't know if I have time to brief it. But I found the history of this history, especially, the Salaf. I was interested to find out how they coped with it. And I could see, definitely there was so much strength in that. And people also debated about in our day and age as well, whether this is a punishment or is this a test. And this happened at that time as well. And to quote the hadith of Rasulullah Sallallahu reported by Aisha Raziallah, she said, Rasulullah Sallallahu said, it is a punishment that Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala sends upon whoever He wills, but He made it a mercy for the believers. And servants who remain in a land afflicted by plague, being patient and hoping for reward from Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, knowing that nothing will befall him except that Allah wills, will receive a reward of martyr. So even if you die, or even if you live patiently and do what you are supposed to do, still it is a reward of a martyr for the believers. And as somebody else has mentioned as well, I think Radia did. So the points of action that we need to do is our emotional and psychological state is very much to do with mental well-being, and poor mental health can lead to mental and physical illnesses. Good mental health gives us resilience. So as Dr. Mansoor mentioned about the holistic approach, we always need to live with that holistic approach. not just when we are sick. When we are healthy, we need to take care of ourselves in a holistic approach, take care of our mental, physical, psychological, spiritual, all sides of the wellness. And yeah. So apart from remaining calm, putting trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, getting help from Salat and Quran, this helps to keep a positive outlook, positive expectation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He knows what is best for us. And when he gives us calamities, or when he gives us trials and tribulations, they are all for our benefits. And that's the positive approach we need to take. And this is also what Dr. Mansoor mentioned as well. People who take positive approach, they do better. We need to keep living our life. We can't stop living, but we need to have connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, family, friends, and patience. Patience is the utmost necessary. And during the disasters or other times, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made so many things for us to teach the patience. Ramadan is a whole month to teach us patience. People who go for Hajj, they need a lot of patience. And that's what we learn from that exercise as well, from that ritual as well of Hajj, patience. And maintaining a daily routine of our prayers, work, exercise, diet, and looking at the nature to reflecting ourselves and seeing the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the nature. It gives a sort of, again, change of focus and aspect of thinking, what is called as mindfulness. Mindfulness is also in Salat, in prayer. Prayer also you follow mindfulness. So to me, these are the ways, and of all, trust in Allah, trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's a creator. Whatever happens through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punish us who we are the creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And if we are believing in him and doing the right thing, he will only want to make us better. If it is that's what Rasulullah said, that if Mu'min are in good way all the way through, if it is a test and the Mu'min exercises patience and remembers him, he will pass the test. But if it is for elevation of his rank, if it is again, if it is elevation of the rank and we go through patiently and the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us, our ranks are raised. So in no way can we be disadvantaged. That's the positive approach we need to take. Jazakallah for asking me that question.
Jazakallah, Dr. Hussain. Yes, I think, again, very, very relevant points. And inshallah, maybe someday I would like to get you on again to talk about mindfulness. I know that mindfulness is something that has become a raging topic these days, but I'm not sure if people even have an inkling of what mindfulness is and how we have been taught mindfulness from, like you said, our very upbringing in our religion. I think that's perhaps going to be another topic for us to talk about another day, inshallah. Now, we have, that brings us to the end of the questions. And before I move on to the questions and answers, we have just a couple of them. So we're not too far behind schedule. I would just like to once again thank the three panelists for giving us your time, giving us your perspective, giving us the wealth of your experience and knowledge. Very humbly, I thank you for sharing with us everything that you have said and everything that you have experienced today. I would also like to thank our attendees for taking the time to listen to all of this. And I hope that, inshallah, it has been of some benefit to all of you, like it has been to me. It has been of immense benefit to me. I would also like to thank my fellow AMP colleagues, committee members, for helping us organize this session today. And inshallah, we will be running more of these sessions, even though the restrictions have been removed. We think that this is a good way of, like Razia said, getting the community together, an alternative way of establishing social connections, inshallah. So the first question that we have got from Arif Bhai is about statistics during the pandemic. May I ask Dr. Hussain, as a general, as a GP, about mental health? Have you any statistics about mental depression, anxiety, suicide?
I think Dr. Mansoor might be able to help me
Yeah,
with that. I don't have it
after
at hand.
this. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the pandemic, there certainly has been increase in the number of depression, anxiety presentations to the mental health services, lots of referrals. But the early reports suggest there hasn't been much change in the suicidal rates, although we might see a different picture once we have all the coroner reports and everything, so by next year. But so far, the early reports suggest there hasn't been any changes in the suicidal rates, but definitely there's been overwhelming referrals to the mental health services, and it's in the public mental health services because we have limited resources as well. So a lot of the people after the initial screening, they're not being taken on and referred back to the care of GP, which is unfortunate because they feel that their illness is not severe enough, and because of the limitation of resources or not enough healthcare workers, they can't just, the system is getting overloaded. Now, people presenting with suicidal thoughts or at increased suicidal risk, they do get taken by the mental health services, but unfortunately all other people are there referred back to the care of the GP and psychologists, and there's a lot of people who could be too complex to be management and to be managed by GPs, but they're not severe enough to be managed by public mental health services, and they slip through the cracks. And I think we were talking about the increased funding, and hopefully that will help with that.
Inshallah. There was also, if I can just add a supplementary, there was a little bit about increase of self-harm, especially in between the 30 and 40s. Dr. Mansoor, any comment about that?
Yeah. People who self-harm, generally this is their coping mechanism, which is an unhealthy coping mechanism. Normally, if you talk to many of the people who self-harm, majority of them will say that they try to replace their emotional pain with physical pain because they feel the emotional pain is too strong to bear, and just makes it easier to distract from the emotional pain and then focus on the physical pain. And obviously with the COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of issues relating to not able to meet the family or loss of jobs. And so all those negative events in their life that causes increased self-harming risk.
Jazakallah. Thank you. I think the next question is also one for you, Dr. Mansoor, about causes of depression, knowing that a person is in depression. So maybe you can answer that as well.
Yeah. So like with most medical specialties, we don't have a blood test or an imaging test to find out how depressed the patient is. So it depends on a lot on what the patient tell us as well, but also subjectively from our experience, because we've seen so many depressed and severely depressed people throughout our career, and we can also do an assessment based on what we think, and also based on the history, what the patient tells us. And usually with severe depression, people often have suicidal thoughts and not wanting to be alive. But that's not just the only criteria. There's multiple other criterias. It affects so many things like sleep, appetite, energy levels, focus, concentration, and negative thinking. So it's some like the severity of all these signs and symptoms based on the assessments, and also for how long these people have been feeling depressed for. Because to diagnose, like, feeling sad is a normal human emotion, and everyone feels sad from time to time. But to diagnose clinical depression, they have to be sad for at least 2 weeks for most of the day to be labeled as clinical depression. And also depends on what sort of protective factors they have. Like if they have a good supportive family, or that's a protective factor. If they're by themselves, they're alone, and if they're drinking alcohol and things like that, so that also can make the depression quite severe as well, with the lack of protective factors.
So if there is even a remote suspicion of behavior pointing towards depression, Dr. Masood, the first point of call would be the GP, just to go and meet the GP and have a chat with the GP. Is that correct?
Yep. The first point of call is always the GP. We do have like a CAT team, which is a crisis and assessment team. If after hours, or they're basically available 24/7, and there's other helplines as well they can contact if they're severely suicidal. That's the emergency services. But normally for depression, anxiety, any mental illness, the first point of contact is always the GP. And often they are treated by their GPs, and unless there hasn't been any improvement in their symptoms, or if they're too complex or too high risk, the GPs refer them to the public mental health services or private psychologists, depending on the needs.
Thank you.
I can add on to that.
Sure. Yes.
Most of the patients that come to general practice, the first call to us, they are sort of mild to moderate depression, and which are treated with most of the time with counseling. Some of the GPs are trained to do counseling as well, and they do the counseling themselves. Others refer them to the counseling GPs or to the psychologists. And if they are a bit more to moderate depression, again, it depends upon the assessment whether pharmacological therapy is needed or not. And again, in our community, people are very afraid of taking medication. They will take medication for diabetes or high blood pressure or any other illness, but they don't want to take medication for any mental illnesses. They don't want to take medication for depression. This is something, that we need to educate our community as well. Depression can be, as Radhia mentioned, it can be as an illness, and sometimes it needed to be treated with pharmacological therapy. It won't go away unless it is treated. It will only get severe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Mr. Shabir mentioned in the last talk, there was some talk about the stigma of mental illness. Unfortunately, this stigma exists in our community much more than the Western community. So, and I agree with Dr. Mariam that just educating about educating our community about the mental illness. Often people think mental illness as a sign of mental weakness, which is quite wrong. But unfortunately, it's quite prevalent in our culture.
Yes, probably something we need to address in more detail, because this stigma keeps popping up all the time, Dr. Mansoor. Look, we have gone over time. It's just about 7:15 now, so we don't have any further questions. Do any of you, the three of you, have any final word to add or to say before we conclude the session?
If I may.
Sure, Doctor. Yes.
Yeah, when I was talking about resilience, I mentioned that so far I have not seen any negative cases, but I forgot one. This is a lady who has suffered from anxiety for a long, long time. And she became worse. She became worse during the COVID. So this again proves about what we were discussing about a person's personality. Previous to the disaster and post-disaster, people who did not cope very well before will get worse with the disasters. So yeah, the two other cases that I quoted, one was a child, only 5-year-old, and the other one was 73 years old. And looking at their previous history, she has coped so well throughout her life, and she continues to cope even with her personal disabilities and all that. So many people in that age group, you will find them in an old age home, but this woman is living independently and looking after herself and her husband, doing all the housework, cooking, all that. So not many 73-year-olds will do that. But this other lady who has suffered from anxiety from teenage years, she's, I think, about 45, 50 years old, and she became worse and had to be referred to a psychologist, and she's on anti-anxiolytics as well. So yeah, so I just wanted to show that as well.
Thank you, Jazakallah. You know, I think it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that the people who build the skills to be resilient, either through faith, to prayer, through all of that, will continue to, to meet difficulties and come up stronger, whereas perhaps those that do not have the proper skills will almost continuously not be able to cope. I know that's a very, very broad statement, and we've run out of time. I would, love to have another discussion on that. That, equipping people with the skills to be resilient is another factor all by itself.
Yeah. Thanks.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you all, and once again, my great appreciation from all of us at AMP Australia, at AMP Global. Thank you for being a part of this. Jazakallah for your time. And Brother Shoaib, do you have anything to say before we conclude this?
No, that's pretty much it. So thank you so much for everyone, and for everyone who has attended. But we've also got this session on YouTube streaming right now, but we will get that one uploaded as well soon, if anyone wants to watch it later stage, inshallah.
Thanks for having me. I thoroughly enjoyed. I'm sure the other guests did the same.
Thank you, everyone.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, and inshallah we shall be in touch again.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Salam.